Jack Peterson adjusted the brim of his worn baseball cap, pulling it lower over his eyes as he stepped out of his car. The spring air was crisp, carrying the faint aroma of freshly baked bread from the nearby bakery. Across the street stood Peterson's Sandwiches, the flagship location of his sandwich shop chain. The bright red and white sign above the door gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol of a business he had built from scratch over 2 decades. But something felt off. Jack hadn't set foot in this particular shop in over a year. With 5 locations now under his name, he relied heavily on managers and reports to keep things running smoothly. Yet, despite steady customer traffic and glowing online reviews, profits at this location had mysteriously dipped. Employee turnover had also spiked. And Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He glanced at his reflection in the car window, making sure his disguise was intact. Gone was the polished CEO in tailored suits. Instead, he wore a faded flannel shirt, jeans that had seen better days, and boots scuffed from years of use. A few days' worth of stubble added to the look. To anyone else, he was just another middle-aged man stopping by for lunch. Taking a deep breath, Jack crossed the street and pushed open the door. The familiar chime of the bell above the door greeted him as he stepped inside. The smell of fresh bread and sizzling bacon filled the air, mingling with the hum of conversation and clatter of dishes. It should have felt comforting. This was his creation, after all, but Jack couldn't shake the unease settling in his chest. "Table for one?" asked a young cashier without looking up from her phone. "Counter's fine," Jack replied, roughening his voice slightly as he gestured toward an empty stool at the far end of the counter. He settled onto the stool and took a moment to observe. The lunch rush was in full swing. Employees bustled between tables, line cooks shouted orders from behind the kitchen window, and customers chatted over sandwiches and coffee. On the surface, everything seemed normal, efficient even, but Jack's trained eye caught small details that didn't sit well. The cashier who had greeted him barely acknowledged customers as they approached. A manager in a crisp polo shirt sat in a corner booth scrolling through her phone instead of helping with the rush. And then there was Frank. Jack's attention was drawn to an elderly man working at the dishwashing station near the back of the shop. Frank moved with careful precision, stacking plates and scrubbing pans with steady hands that betrayed years of hard work. His wiry frame and shock of white hair made him stand out among the younger staff rushing around him. Frank looked to be in his 70s, far older than anyone else on staff, but there was a quiet dignity in his movements. He didn't rush or complain. Even when a busboy carelessly dumped a tray of dishes into his station, splashing soapy water onto his already soaked apron. "Turkey club and coffee," Jack said when another cashier approached him, a young woman named Lisa, according to her name tag. As Lisa rang up his order, Jack nodded toward Frank. "He has been here long?" Lisa hesitated before answering. "Yeah, forever," she said with a shrug. "Should have retired years ago if you asked me." Jack frowned but didn't press further. "Over the next hour." Jack watched Frank closely while sipping his coffee. The man never stopped moving, washing dishes, wiping down counters, even stepping in to help bus tables when things got busy. Customers greeted him warmly as they passed by the dish window, and Frank always responded with a kind word or smile. But not everyone treated him with respect. At one point, Jack overheard 2 cashiers, Tom and Lisa, whispering near the register while glancing toward Frank. "That old guy's gonna keel over one day," Tom muttered with a smirk. Lisa snickered. "Yeah. But at least he'll probably clean up after himself first." Jack's grip tightened around his coffee cup as anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. He forced himself to stay quiet, for now. Toward the end of the lunch service, a young mother with 2 small children approached the register to pay for their meal. As she opened her wallet, her face fell. She whispered something to Lisa, who immediately frowned and called Tom over. The 2 cashiers spoke in hushed tones while throwing annoyed glances at the woman and her children. The mother's embarrassment was palpable as she tried to explain her situation. Her card had been declined earlier that morning due to an issue with her bank. Before Jack could intervene, Frank appeared at the register. He dried his hands on his apron and quietly slipped some bills from his pocket to Lisa without saying a word. The mother's relief was visible as she gathered her children and left, thanking Frank profusely on her way out. "That's the third time this week," Tom muttered loudly enough for Jack to hear as Frank returned to his station. "Old fool's gonna go broke saving strays," Lisa added with a sneer. Jack's jaw tightened further as he watched Frank shuffle back to work without so much as a glance toward Tom or Lisa. There was no bitterness in his demeanor, just quiet resolve. As Jack finished his sandwich and prepared to leave, he noticed Lisa and Tom huddled near the register again. Their furtive glances toward Frank set off alarm bells in Jack's mind. He couldn't hear what they were saying but caught enough snippets. Missing money. Register short, to know they were up to something. Jack left Peterson's Sandwiches that day with more questions than answers, and a growing determination to find out what was really happening behind those counters. Tomorrow, he would return, not just as an observer but as an owner ready to uncover the truth. The next morning, Jack arrived at Peterson's Sandwiches earlier than usual. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the parking lot. He parked his car in the far corner, keeping his disguise intact: worn jeans, a faded flannel shirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Today wasn't just about observation, it was about uncovering the truth. Inside, the diner was quieter than it had been during the lunch rush yesterday. The hum of the coffee machine and the faint clatter of dishes filled the air. Jack chose a booth near the back, where he could see both the kitchen and the register without drawing attention to himself. Frank was already at work, moving with the same steady rhythm Jack had noticed yesterday. His hands, weathered and red from years of scrubbing dishes, worked methodically as he stacked plates and wiped down counters. Despite his thin frame and visible discomfort, Jack caught him wincing as he bent to pick up a tray, but Frank never slowed down. Jack couldn't help but admire the man's quiet dedication. Frank wasn't just doing his job. He was carrying the weight of the diner's operations on his shoulders. Yet no one seemed to notice, or care. Jack's attention shifted to Lisa and Tom, the two cashiers he had overheard mocking Frank yesterday. They were huddled near the register again, speaking in hushed tones. Jack strained to hear their conversation. "So," Lisa said, her voice low but sharp, "I checked with Patricia. Frank's been here for over 7 years. Tom snorted. 7 years washing dishes? That's pathetic. Lisa smirked. What's pathetic is how he keeps covering for customers who can't pay their bills. Like that single mom yesterday. Yeah, Tom added with a sneer. Playing the hero with what? His social security pennies? Jack tightened his grip on his coffee cup, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He had built this business to be a place of community and respect. Yet here were two employees openly mocking someone who embodied those values. As Jack continued listening, their conversation took an even darker turn. You know, Tom said, leaning closer to Lisa, Patricia's been noticing those register discrepancies. Lisa raised an eyebrow. You think she suspects Frank? Tom shrugged. Not yet. But we can make sure she does. Jack froze, his heart pounding as he realized what they were planning. If we add a little extra to those shortages, Tom continued, and make sure Patricia catches Frank near the register at the wrong time, she'll think he's stealing. Lisa finished with a grin. Jack felt a cold weight settle in his chest. This wasn't just idle gossip. It was a calculated scheme to frame an innocent man, a man who had spent years quietly helping others while struggling himself. As Jack processed what he had just heard, Frank emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of clean plates. He paused near a table where a young mother was counting out change to pay for her meal. Her face fell as she realized she didn't have enough. Without hesitation, Frank reached into his pocket and handed her a few bills. "Don't worry about it," he said kindly. "We all need help sometimes." The woman's eyes filled with gratitude as she thanked him profusely before leaving with her children. Jack watched as Frank returned to his station, unaware that Lisa and Tom were smirking behind him. By the time Jack left Peterson's Sandwiches that afternoon, he had seen enough to confirm his suspicions. Lisa and Tom weren't just mocking Frank, they were actively working to sabotage him. But Jack wasn't going to let that happen. He spent the evening making phone calls and setting up hidden cameras throughout the diner. If Lisa and Tom thought they could frame Frank without consequences, they were about to learn otherwise. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, justice would be served, not just for Frank but for every employee who deserved better than this toxic culture. The next morning, Jack Peterson arrived at Peterson's Sandwiches earlier than usual. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow over the diner's iconic red and white sign. Today wasn't just another day, it was the day Jack planned to uncover the truth. He parked his car a block away and entered through the back door, still wearing his disguise of faded jeans and a flannel shirt. The diner was quiet, with only a few early morning employees preparing for the breakfast rush. Frank was already at his station, meticulously washing dishes as usual. His movements were slower today, and Jack noticed him pause to rub his lower back before continuing. Jack nodded to himself. Frank's dedication wasn't just admirable, it was heartbreaking. But today wasn't about admiration, it was about justice. Before the diner opened, Jack met briefly with Patricia, the manager on duty. He explained that he had installed hidden cameras overnight to address discrepancies in the cash register and ensure accountability. Patricia seemed surprised but nodded in agreement, clearly uneasy about what Jack might find. By 8 a.m., the diner was bustling with customers. Jack took his usual seat in the corner booth, sipping coffee and pretending to read a newspaper while keeping a close eye on Lisa and Tom at the register. Their behavior was as suspicious as ever: furtive glances, whispered conversations, and occasional smirks directed toward Frank. Around mid-morning, Jack saw his opportunity. A young woman with 2 small children approached the counter to pay for their meal. Jack recognized her from yesterday. She was the same mother Frank had helped when her card was declined. "I'm so sorry," she said softly to Lisa. "I thought I had enough cash, but I'm short again." Lisa's smile turned icy as she glanced at Tom. "Don't worry," she said loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. "Frank will cover it, he always does." Frank looked up from his station, his face lined with concern but no hesitation. He dried his hands on his apron and walked over to the register. "It's no trouble," he said kindly, pulling a few bills from his pocket and handing them to Lisa. The young mother thanked him profusely before leaving with her children. Frank returned to his station without saying anything else. But Jack noticed Lisa and Tom exchange satisfied grins. By noon, Jack had seen enough. He stood up from his booth and walked toward Patricia's office, signaling for her to follow him into the kitchen where Frank was working. "Frank," Jack said gently, "could you join us for a moment?" Frank looked up in surprise but nodded, wiping his hands on his apron as he followed them into the back office. Once inside, Jack removed his baseball cap and glasses, revealing his true identity. Frank's eyes widened in shock. "Mr. Peterson?" he stammered. "Yes," Jack replied with a small smile. "And I owe you an explanation, and an apology." Before Frank could respond, Patricia entered the room holding a tablet connected to the hidden cameras Jack had installed. She looked pale as she handed it to him. "Mr. Peterson," she began hesitantly, "you need to see this." Jack played back footage from earlier that morning. The video clearly showed Lisa and Tom manipulating the cash register totals while making snide comments about Frank's generosity. "They've been framing me," Frank said quietly as realization dawned on him. Jack nodded grimly. "Yes, they have." Jack wasted no time confronting Lisa and Tom in front of the entire staff during a mandatory meeting that afternoon. "I've been here all week," he began, addressing the group, "watching how this diner operates, and how some of you treat your coworkers." Lisa and Tom exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. "Thanks to hidden cameras," Jack continued, holding up the tablet, "I now have evidence of theft, manipulation of cash registers, and a deliberate attempt to frame an innocent man." Gasps rippled through the room as Jack played clips from the footage. The staff watched in stunned silence as Lisa and Tom's actions were laid bare for everyone to see. "This behavior is unacceptable," Jack said firmly as he turned toward them. "You're both fired, effective immediately." Tom opened his mouth to protest but quickly shut it when he saw the cold determination in Jack's eyes. Lisa burst into tears but didn't argue as they were escorted out of the diner by Patricia. After the meeting ended and the staff dispersed, Jack sat down with Frank in Patricia's office. "Frank," he began softly, "I want you to know how much I admire your dedication, not just to this diner but to everyone who walks through its doors." Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair but didn't interrupt. "You've been carrying this place on your shoulders for years," Jack continued, "and it's time someone carried you for a change." He slid an envelope across the desk toward Frank. Inside was a letter offering him a promotion to assistant manager, with higher pay, full benefits, and more manageable hours. Frank stared at it in disbelief before looking up at Jack with tears in his eyes. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "Say yes," Jack replied with a smile. As Frank left the office with renewed hope in his heart, Jack turned back to Patricia. "We're not stopping here," he said firmly. "I want every employee trained on ethical practices, and I want regular check-ins with staff to make sure something like this never happens again." Patricia nodded eagerly. "Understood. And one more thing," Jack added as he stood up. "Let's set up an emergency fund for employees who need help, so people like Frank don't have to carry that burden alone." Patricia smiled warmly. "That's a great idea." As Jack stepped out onto the diner floor, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about saving one man, it was about rebuilding trust and creating a culture of kindness and integrity throughout Peterson's sandwiches. And for the first time in a long time, he knew he was on the right path. The next morning, Jack Peterson arrived at Peterson's sandwiches earlier than usual. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the diner's red and white sign. Inside, the atmosphere felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. Employees moved cautiously, their conversations hushed as they glanced toward the door, unsure of what to expect after yesterday's revelations. Jack stepped inside, his usual disguise gone. Today, he wasn't here to observe, he was here to lead. Jack spotted Frank near the dishwashing station, already hard at work despite the early hour. His movements were slower than usual, and Jack noticed him pause to rub his wrist before continuing. The sight stirred something in Jack, a mix of admiration and guilt. "Frank," Jack called out as he approached. Frank looked up, surprised to see Jack without his cap and flannel shirt. "Mr. Peterson?" he asked hesitantly. Jack smiled warmly. "I'd like you to join me in my office for a moment." Frank hesitated but nodded, drying his hands on his apron before following Jack to the back office. The room was small and cluttered, with stacks of papers and a faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. "Please have a seat," Jack said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Frank sat down cautiously, his weathered hands resting on his lap. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly. Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Frank, I owe you an apology," he began. Not just for what happened yesterday, but for everything you've endured while working here. Frank's brow furrowed in confusion. You don't need to apologize, Mr. Peterson. This job has been a blessing. No, Jack interrupted gently but firmly. It hasn't been, not the way it should have been. He slid a folder across the desk toward Frank. Inside was an offer letter for a promotion to assistant manager, complete with a significant pay raise, full benefits, and reduced hours. Frank stared at the document in disbelief. I don't understand, he murmured. It's simple, Jack said with a smile. You've been carrying this place on your shoulders for years, working harder than anyone else and showing more integrity than most people could ever hope to have. It's time someone recognized that. After their conversation, Jack called an all-staff meeting in the dining area. Employees gathered reluctantly, their expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension. Jack stood at the center of the room, his presence commanding yet approachable. I've spent the past few days observing how this diner operates, he began, his voice calm but firm. And what I've seen has been both inspiring and deeply troubling. He paused, letting his words sink in. Let me start with what inspires me, he continued. Frank Lawson is a shining example of what this business should stand for: hard work, kindness, and integrity. A few employees nodded in agreement as Frank shifted uncomfortably under the attention. But, Jack added sharply, there are others here who have failed to uphold those values, and that ends today. He turned toward Lisa and Tom, who stood near the back of the room, looking visibly nervous. Lisa and Tom, Jack said firmly, you've been caught manipulating cash registers and plotting against your co-workers. Your actions are not only unethical, they're unacceptable. Lisa opened her mouth to protest but quickly shut it when she saw Jack's unwavering expression. You're both fired, effective immediately, Jack announced. Gasps rippled through the room as Lisa and Tom were escorted out by Patricia, who looked equally stunned by the turn of events. Once Lisa and Tom were gone, Jack turned back to address the remaining staff. Starting today, he said firmly, we're implementing new policies to ensure transparency and fairness in every aspect of this business. He outlined several key changes. 1. Ethics training. Every employee would undergo mandatory training on ethical practices. 2. Employee support. A new emergency fund would be established to help employees facing financial hardships. 3. Customer transparency. Full disclosure would be required for all transactions, no exceptions. 4. Performance reviews. Promotions and bonuses would now be tied to customer satisfaction rather than sales metrics alone. Jack scanned the room as he spoke, making eye contact with each employee. If anyone has a problem with these changes or feels they can't adapt, you're free to leave. A heavy silence filled the room as employees processed his words. I know change isn't easy, Jack continued more softly, but it's necessary if we want this place to be something we can all be proud of. After the meeting ended and employees began returning to their stations, Jack pulled Frank aside once more. There's one more thing I'd like you to do, Jack said. What's that? Frank asked cautiously. I want you to help me oversee these changes, Jack replied with a smile. You've got more experience and integrity than anyone else here, and I can't think of anyone better suited for the job. Frank hesitated for a moment before nodding slowly. I'll do my best. I know you will, Jack said confidently. Over the next few weeks, employees began embracing the new policies as they saw firsthand how they improved both morale and customer satisfaction. Customers noticed, and appreciated, the increased transparency during their dining experiences. Frank thrived in his new role as assistant manager, mentoring younger staff members and fostering a sense of community within the diner. One afternoon, a regular customer approached Frank at the counter with tears in her eyes. Thank you for everything you've done, she said softly. This place feels like home again. Frank smiled warmly but humbly replied, It's not just me, it's all of us. from across the room. Jack watched the interaction with pride swelling in his chest. This wasn't just about fixing one diner, it was about building something better from the ground up. And with people like Frank by his side, he knew it was possible. The sun rose over Peterson's sandwiches, casting warm light onto the iconic red and white sign of the flagship store. Inside, the diner buzzed with a different kind of energy. Word had spread quickly about Jack Peterson's undercover visit and the dramatic changes he had implemented. Customers filled every booth, not just for their favorite sandwiches but to show support for Henry Lawson, the man whose quiet kindness had touched so many lives. Jack arrived early, dressed simply in a button-down shirt and jeans, a deliberate choice to show that today wasn't about being the CEO. It was about being part of the team. He wanted to make it clear that this wasn't just another day, it was the start of something new. Henry arrived shortly after, his old Buick coughing into its usual parking spot. As he stepped out, his movements were careful but purposeful. When he walked through the diner doors, a wave of applause erupted from customers and staff alike. Henry froze mid-step, his weathered hands clutching his apron tightly. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. Jack stepped forward with a warm smile. "It's for you, Henry." Henry blinked, clearly overwhelmed by the attention. "I don't understand," he murmured. "You will," Jack replied gently. "But first, let's talk." He gestured toward his office, and Henry followed hesitantly. Inside, Jack motioned for him to sit down. "I've spent the last few days learning more about you," Jack began, leaning forward slightly. "About your dedication to this diner, your kindness to customers, and your willingness to go above and beyond, even when no one was watching." Henry shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I was just doing my job." "No," Jack said firmly. "You were doing far more than that." Jack slid a folder across the desk toward Henry. Inside was an official letter offering him a promotion to assistant manager, complete with higher pay, full benefits, and reduced hours. Henry stared at the letter for a long moment before looking up at Jack. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Because you've earned it," Jack replied simply. "You've been carrying this place on your shoulders for years, working harder than anyone else and showing more integrity than most people could ever hope to have." Henry's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he nodded slowly. "Thank you," he whispered. After their conversation, Jack called an all-staff meeting in the dining area. Employees gathered around him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension. "I've spent this week observing how this diner operates," Jack began, his voice steady but commanding. "And what I've seen has been both inspiring and deeply troubling." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Let me start with what inspires me. Henry Lawson is everything this business should stand for: hard work, kindness, and integrity." A round of applause broke out as Henry shifted uncomfortably under the attention. "But," Jack added sharply, "there are others here who have failed to uphold those values, and that ends today." The room fell silent as Jack outlined several key changes. 1. Ethics training. Every employee would undergo mandatory training on ethical practices. 2. Employee support. A new emergency fund would be established to help employees facing financial hardships. 3. Pay raises. All staff would receive a wage increase to ensure they could live comfortably. 4. Customer transparency. Full disclosure would be required for all transactions, no exceptions. Jack scanned the room as he spoke, making eye contact with each employee. "If anyone has a problem with these changes or feels they can't adapt, you're free to leave." A heavy silence filled the room as employees processed his words. "I know change isn't easy," Jack continued more softly, "but it's necessary if we want this place to be something we can all be proud of." As the meeting ended and employees returned to their stations, customers began stepping forward to share their gratitude for Henry's kindness over the years. One woman approached him with tears in her eyes. You helped me when I didn't have enough money to feed my kids, she said softly. I'll never forget that. Another customer chimed in. You stayed late one night just so I could pick up my order after work. You didn't have to do that. Henry smiled humbly but said little, clearly overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. From across the room, Jack watched with pride swelling in his chest. This wasn't just about fixing one diner, it was about creating something better from the ground up. Over the next few weeks, employees began embracing the new policies as they saw firsthand how they improved both morale and customer satisfaction. Customers noticed, and appreciated, the increased transparency during their dining experiences. Henry thrived in his new role as assistant manager, mentoring younger staff members and fostering a sense of community within the diner. One afternoon, a young mother approached Henry at the counter with her 2 children in tow. Thank you for everything you've done, she said softly. This place feels like home again. Henry smiled warmly but humbly replied, It's not just me, it's all of us. From across the room, Jack watched the interaction with a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about sandwiches or profits, it was about people. And with employees like Henry by his side, he knew Peterson's sandwiches would thrive for years to come.